Lionel Jones. The prosecutor rose, his voice cold and sharp, echoing through the courtroom.
We have gathered enough evidence to end your empire.
He placed the thick file on the table. Before the case is transferred to the jury, do you have any final words for the court? The judge's gavel hovered above the bench. Prosecutor William Carter had just finished his closing statement, and the jury was minutes from being called. In the front row, Lionel Jones, the man once called the last untouchable crime boss in the city, sat in silence, hands cuffed, eyes fixed on nothing. Then the courtroom doors swung open. A young black woman in a sharp gray suit walked in, a leather case gripped tight in her hand. 10 years ago, Lionel Jones had pulled her out of the cold and called her his daughter. Today, she wasn't here as his daughter. She was here as his lawyer. If you've ever wondered what real loyalty looks like when everything is on the line, stay with this one till the end. And if stories like this hit different for you, hit subscribe now, because this channel is where they live. Lionel Jones ran the docks the way other men ran countries. Every container that moved through the harbor, every truck that rolled out before dawn, every union boss who kept his mouth shut, all of it bent to his will. 20 years in the business had taught him one rule above all others. Fear built empires faster than loyalty ever could. Men who crossed him disappeared quietly. Men who served him well were rewarded generously. It was a simple ledger, and Lionel balanced it without apology. But even a man like Lionel Jones had lines he refused to cross. Children, civilians, people who had nothing to do with the world he'd built. That line had been drawn long before he understood why it mattered, and it would take one winter night to show him. The night was the kind that punished anyone caught outside too long. Lionel was walking back to his car after a meeting that had gone sideways, his coat collar turned up against the wind. When he heard it, a small, sharp voice cutting through the cold beneath an overpass. Please, not money, food. He hasn't eaten in 2 days. He found her crouched beneath the bridge, no older than 8, a boy even younger wrapped inside her thin jacket. Her name was Amara. She wasn't crying. She wasn't begging in the way people begged when they wanted pity. She was negotiating, fierce and clear-eyed, as if she'd already decided that whatever happened next, she would not let her brother go without a fight. Lionel had seen desperation before. He had caused plenty of it himself. But something about the girl's refusal to break stopped him cold. He didn't call it conscience. He wasn't sure he had one left. He called it recognition, the same hunger for survival he'd carried out of his own childhood decades ago. Before the docks, before the money, before he became a man, other men feared. He took them both to the hospital. He paid for everything. No questions, no strings. The way he paid for anything he wanted handled quietly. The boy held on for 3 days. Then he didn't. There was no funeral in the traditional sense, just a small service. Lionel arranged himself, a handful of strangers standing in the cold. Amara didn't cry there either. When it was over, she walked up to him, looked him directly in the eye, and said the only thing she had left to offer. You didn't have to do any of this. Nobody does anything for free. So what do you want from me? Lionel knelt down to her level, something he hadn't done for anyone in years. Nothing, he said. But if you want somewhere to stay, I've got room. She studied him the way she'd studied every stranger who'd ever offered her something, searching for the catch. She didn't find one, or she decided she was too tired to keep looking. Either way, she nodded once, and that was that. Amara grew up in Lionel Jones's house, behind gates most people never got close to, surrounded by a staff who called her Miss Amara and men who called her father Boss. She had tutors instead of public school, a driver instead of a bus route, and a childhood that looked, from the outside, like something out of a magazine. But she was never blind to what paid for it. She noticed the way certain visitors arrived late at night and left before sunrise. She noticed the study door that locked from the inside during meetings, and the silence that followed certain conversations like a held breath. Lionel gave her everything a father could give a daughter except the truth about what his empire actually cost and where the weight of that cost was buried. For a while, that was enough. She loved him fiercely, the way a child loves the person who chose her when no one else would. It would take years before she understood that loving him and saving him were going to be two very different things. By the time Amara turned 16, she had stopped pretending she didn't understand what her father did for a living. She'd seen enough by then, not the violence itself. Lionel made sure of that, but the aftermath of it. The sudden absence of men who had been at dinner the week before. The hush that fell over the house whenever a certain name was mentioned. She learned to read the silences the way other girls read report cards. One name kept surfacing more than any other: Daniel Reeves. Reeves had been at Lionel's side since before the docs, before the money, back when Lionel was just a kid with nothing but nerve. He was the one who reviewed every contract, moved every dollar, whispered in every ear before a decision got made. To the outside world, Lionel Jones ran the empire. Amara was beginning to suspect that Reeves ran Lionel. She started watching him the way he probably thought, only he watched others quietly from the edges of rooms. She noticed how every difficult decision Lionel made had somehow already been shaped by a conversation with Reeves an hour earlier. She noticed how Reeves smiled at her with a warmth that never quite reached his eyes. She also noticed the small, quiet loyalty Reeves commanded from certain men on the payroll, men who answered to him faster than they answered to Lionel, though none of them would ever have admitted it out loud. And she noticed something else, something she wasn't supposed to see. A folder left open on her father's desk, a line in his will naming her, not Reeves, as the one who would inherit control of the legitimate holdings if anything happened to him. She didn't understand the full weight of it then, but she understood enough to know that Reeves, if he ever found out, would not take it well. She tried to warn her father anyway, choosing her words carefully one evening after dinner. "I don't trust him," she said. "I think he's using you." Lionel didn't even look up from his drink. "Reeves has been with me 20 years. You're 16. That doesn't mean he's loyal. It just means he's patient." Lionel set the glass down, and for a moment something flickered behind his eyes. Not doubt, exactly, but the ghost of it. Then it was gone. "You don't know what loyalty costs a man like me," he said. "You've never had to build anything. You've only ever had it given to you." The words landed harder than he probably intended. Amara didn't argue further. She'd learned that arguing with her father rarely changed his mind, it only taught him to guard it better. But she kept watching Reeves. She kept a mental record of every meeting he steered, every deal he advised Lionel into, every small transfer of power that looked, on paper, like loyalty and felt, in the room, like something closer to a slow, patient theft. She didn't have proof yet. She didn't have the language of law or finance to name what she was seeing. But she had the one thing Reeves had never counted on: a daughter who was paying far closer attention than anyone in that house believed a 16-year-old capable of. The moment that changed everything came 8 months later, and it didn't come from Lionel, it came from Reeves. Amara overheard it by accident, a name mentioned in passing between two of Reeves's men in the hallway outside the study. Tommy Bishop, a dock worker's son, 19 years old, who'd been seen talking to a federal investigator outside a diner 3 towns over. Reeves had already decided what that meant, and he'd already decided what to do about it. Amara knew Tommy. Not well, but enough. He'd delivered groceries to the house as a teenager, always polite, always in a hurry to get back to his sick father. He wasn't an informant. He was a kid trying to get his father's medical bills paid, and he'd made the mistake of being seen in the wrong place at the wrong time. She went to Lionel first. He was in a meeting and waved her off without listening. She went to Reeves next, hoping reason might work where panic hadn't. It didn't. The boy talked to a federal agent, Reeves said, calm as ever, straightening his cuffs. Whether he meant to or not doesn't matter. It's a liability. Liabilities get handled. He has nothing to give them. He doesn't know anything. That's not a risk I'm willing to take with your father's freedom. Reeves smiled, and it was the same warm, empty smile she'd cataloged for years. Go back to your studies, Amara. This isn't your world yet. She didn't go back to her studies. She went to the garage, took her father's car without asking, and drove to the address she'd heard Reeves's men mention, a warehouse near the water where Tommy worked night shifts. She found him locking up, oblivious, and told him to run before he even understood why. He didn't argue. Something in her voice must have told him not to. Reeves found out an hour later he didn't yell. He never yelled. He simply appeared in the doorway of her room that night, arms folded, voice level as a blade. "You want to change how this business works?" he said. "Then learn how it actually works first." Sentiment gets people killed faster than bullets do. Amara stared at him, and for the first time, she understood with total clarity that she was looking at the true architecture of her father's empire. Not Lionel's temper, not Lionel's fear, but Reeves's cold, patient calculation dressed up as loyalty for 20 years. She packed a bag 2 days later. She found Lionel in his study and told him she was leaving to study law. He assumed, as she'd known he would, that it was rejection, a daughter finally ashamed of where she came from. She let him believe it because the truth was too large to explain in the time she had. "I'll come back," she told him at the door. "Not to inherit this. To get you out from under it." Lionel didn't answer. He looked at her the way he looked at men who had already made up their minds to betray him with distance and something that might have been grief buried too deep to show. "Then go," he said. "I won't keep anyone who doesn't want to stay." The door closed between them, and neither one said another word. For the next 10 years, Daniel Reeves built his own empire inside the shell of Lionel Jones's. It happened slowly, the way rot always does, one small transaction at a time, each one defensible on its own, each one part of a larger pattern only visible in hindsight. He set up shell companies registered in 3 different states, then offshore accounts that existed only on paper. He forged Lionel's signature on transfers Lionel never saw, using a version of the man's handwriting he'd studied for 2 decades. Every trail he built pointed, with careful precision, back to Lionel Jones, and nowhere near himself. The old guard noticed the changes before Lionel did. Men who'd worked the docks for years, suddenly reassigned, replaced, or simply gone. Reeves called it restructuring. He called it protecting the business from federal attention. What he was actually doing was clearing out anyone who might still be loyal to Lionel alone and replacing them with men who owed their positions and their silence to him. One of those men was a quiet, heavy-set enforcer named Curtis Dale, hired personally by Reeves, paid by Reeves, and loyal to no one else in that organization. By the time federal investigators started asking questions, the paper trail was already in place, and it told a very convincing story. Lionel Jones, laundering money through international accounts, ordering the silencing of witnesses, running an empire built on decades of blood. None of it was entirely false. Lionel had done terrible things in his life. But the specific crimes stacking up against him now weren't his. They were Reeves's, wearing his name like a mask. The press had a phrase for it within a year. The last untouchable finally falling. Lionel read the headlines with the strange detachment of a man watching his own life described by someone else. He didn't know yet how much of it was true and how much of it was engineered. He only knew the walls were closing in faster than he could understand why. 3 states away, Amara graduated top of her class and turned down every offer from the city's biggest firms. Instead, she took a position at a small practice specializing in financial crime unglamorous work, the kind nobody photographed for magazine covers. It was exactly what she wanted. It taught her how money hid, how paper trails were built to deceive, and how to unbuild them one signature at a time. She practiced under her mother's maiden name, Amara Whitfield, a name with no public record tying it to Lionel Jones at all. On weekends and stolen evenings, she chased threads that had nothing to do with her clients and everything to do with the empire she'd walked away from. She filed public records requests under professional pretenses. She tracked incorporation documents through 3 states. She flew to a bank in the Cayman Islands on her own dime, posing as a compliance researcher, and walked out with the first hard evidence connecting a shell company to Daniel Reeves personally. It took years to build. She kept every document, every notarized statement, every forensic handwriting analysis in a single growing file, locked away where no one, not her firm, not her father, not Reeves, knew it existed. She never reached out to Lionel. Not a call, not a letter, not a message passed through anyone who might carry it back. She told herself it was because there was nothing to say yet, that showing up empty-handed would only confirm what he already believed about her leaving. The truth was simpler and harder to admit. She wasn't ready to face what she might find waiting for her if she went back too soon. So she kept building, quietly, patiently, matching Reeves's decade of patience with one of her own. The indictment came on a Tuesday morning, delivered by federal agents who arrived at the Jones estate with more paperwork than Lionel had bodyguards. Money laundering, extortion, conspiracy to intimidate a federal witness. The charges read like a summary of everything Reeves had spent 10 years constructing, and Lionel Jones, who had, in fact, done terrible things in his life, just not these specific ones, found himself unable to prove a negative against evidence that looked airtight from every angle. To anyone watching from the outside, the story seemed complete. The daughter who'd once been pulled off the streets had vanished from Lionel's life the day she walked out that door, presumably choosing a clean life far away from the man who raised her. The empire was collapsing exactly the way empires collapse from the inside, slowly, then all at once. Reeves made sure of that narrative every chance he got, expressing quiet, practiced sympathy to reporters about how far Lionel Jones had fallen, how sad it was, how inevitable. But the story the world believed was not the story that was actually happening. For 10 years, Amara had never once stopped thinking about the man who'd knelt down beside a bridge and asked nothing in return. Every case file she built, every account she traced, every night she spent awake cross-referencing bank records was, in its own way, a promise she was keeping. She hadn't disappeared. She had been waiting not for the right moment, but for enough evidence that the moment, when it came, could not be denied. By the time the indictment was announced, her file was nearly complete. She had bank records tying Reeves's shell companies to specific transfers. She had a forensic document examiner's sworn analysis proving Lionel's signature had been forged on at least 6 critical documents. She had recorded testimony from a former associate willing to talk now that Reeves no longer had leverage over him. What she didn't have yet was a way into the courtroom, a legal standing to present any of it before a jury that had already been told exactly who Lionel Jones was. She spent the final weeks before trial filing for emergency co-counsel status, drafting the motion herself late into the night, knowing that if the judge refused, 10 years of work would sit useless in a locked file cabinet while her father went to prison for crimes committed by the man who'd once told her sentiment gets people killed. The question was no longer whether Lionel Jones would be convicted. Every indicator pointed to yes. The question, the only one that mattered now, was whether Amara could get through that courtroom door before the jury was handed a case built entirely on someone else's lies, before 10 years of silence became 10 years too late. She filed the motion on a Thursday. The trial's final phase began the following Monday. She had 96 hours to find a way in. The trial moved faster than Amara's motion did. Her emergency filing sat buried in a judge's queue, unread, while inside the courtroom the prosecution methodically laid out its case against Lionel Jones. Bank statements, wire transfers, a forensic accountant testifying with total confidence that the signatures were authentic, an analysis Amara knew for a fact had been rushed and incomplete, but had no standing yet to challenge. Lionel's assigned defense attorney, a man named Walter Higgins, who had come recommended, conveniently, by Daniel Reeves himself, mounted a defense so passive it barely qualified as one. He failed to cross-examine key witnesses. He let damaging testimony stand unchallenged. He seemed, at every turn, less interested in winning than in losing quietly and on schedule. One by one, men who had worked for Lionel for decades took the stand and testified against him, some out of genuine fear, others because Reeves had already promised them protection in exchange for cooperation. The jury watched loyalty dissolve in real time, and with it, whatever sympathy they might have held for the man in the defendant's chair. Reeves sat in the gallery each day, 3 rows back, dressed impeccably, watching the proceedings with the stillness of a man who had already won. Curtis Dale sat close beside him, as he always did now, quiet and watchful, the way a man sits when he's waiting on instructions rather than a verdict. Reeves offered no testimony, drew no attention, made no mistakes. 10 years of careful construction were paying off exactly as planned, and he intended to enjoy watching the final beam fall into place. Lionel, for his part, said almost nothing throughout the trial. He answered questions from his attorney in short, flat sentences, offered no explanations to the press, showed no emotion when the evidence mounted against him. Those who knew him best would have recognized the look on his face, not the fear of a guilty man caught, but the exhaustion of an innocent one who understood, finally and completely, that guilt didn't require truth. It only required a good enough story told by the right person at the right time. By Friday afternoon, the prosecution rested. The defense, such as it was, offered nothing to counter it. The judge announced that closing arguments would begin Monday morning, and that the case would go to the jury by early afternoon. Amara received the notice of her motion's approval at 6:47 that Sunday evening, granted, finally, after a judge's clerk flagged the filing as urgent. She had less than 16 hours before the courtroom doors opened for the final day. She didn't sleep. She spent the night organizing 10 years of evidence into an order 12 minutes could survive being interrupted by, because 12 minutes, she suspected, was about all she was going to get. Monday morning, the courtroom filled to capacity for what everyone assumed would be the final formality before deliberation began. The judge reviewed her notes, glanced at the clock, and prepared to address the jury. Then the doors at the back of the room opened. Amara walked in wearing the same gray suit she'd worn to every deposition for the past decade, a leather case in one hand and a single sheet of paper in the other. The judge's signed order, granting her emergency co-counsel status, filed under the name Amara Whitfield, and, until that moment, unknown to anyone in that room as connected to the defendant at all. "Your Honor," she said, voice steady despite the sea of eyes turning toward her, "I'd like to be recognized as co-counsel for the defense. I have new evidence directly relevant to the charges before this court." Walter Higgins looked as though someone had struck him. He rose, muttered no objection, and stepped aside toward the defense table without argument, relieved, more than anything, to no longer be the one holding a losing hand. Amara crossed the room and took the seat directly beside Lionel, close enough now that she was no longer just a voice in the aisle, but a presence at his side. Lionel turned slowly, and for one long moment simply stared at the woman sitting next to him, the same eyes, the same stubborn set of the jaw he remembered from a girl standing beneath a bridge, older now, but unmistakably his. The judge, after a pause, allowed it. What followed took 11 minutes. Amara laid out banking records tracing 3 shell companies to a single beneficial owner. She introduced the sworn statement of a forensic document examiner, one with no prior connection to either side, demonstrating that 6 of Lionel's signatures had been mechanically reproduced from a template not written by hand. She played a recorded statement from a former Jones associate, safely relocated and no longer afraid, naming Daniel Reeves as the architect of every transfer the prosecution had presented as Lionel's crime. The courtroom, silent through most testimony, began to stir. Reeves, 3 rows back, sat rigid, his composure cracking in real time as each piece of evidence landed. When Amara named the Cayman Islands account directly linked to a transfer he had personally authorized, he stood without meaning to. "This is absurd," he said, loud enough for the judge to bring down her gavel. "She's fabricating a narrative to save a man who's guilty of far worse than what's on that indictment." "Mr. Reeves," the judge said sharply, "you are not currently testifying." But it was too late. In his outburst, Reeves had referenced a detail from the Cayman account that had never been made public, a fact only the account's architect could have known. Several jurors exchanged glances. The prosecutor's expression shifted from confidence to concern. In the chaos, Curtis Dale rose from his seat beside Reeves, a hand moving toward his jacket. Before the bailiffs could react, he had a weapon half drawn, his eyes fixed on the defense table, some final desperate instinct to silence the woman, unraveling 10 years of his employer's work before she finished what she'd started. Lionel moved before anyone else did. Still cuffed, seated only a foot from his daughter now, he threw his weight sideways across her, driving her down behind the defense table with a speed that startled even the deputies flanking him. The gun never fired. Bailiffs tackled Dale to the ground within seconds, disarming him amid screaming and overturned chairs. Lionel hit the floor hard, cuffs biting into his wrists, but his eyes found Amara immediately, checking she was unhurt before he registered his own pain. For 10 years, he had believed she'd chosen to leave him behind. In the space of 11 minutes and one gunshot that never came, he understood, with sudden and total clarity, exactly how wrong he had been and how close his old world had just come to costing him everything that actually mattered. The courtroom took several minutes to settle. Curtis Dale was in restraints, the weapon secured, the judge calling for order with a voice that cut through the residual panic. Lionel was helped back into his chair, wrists raw against the cuffs, his gaze still fixed on Amara, as though checking over and over that the last few minutes had actually happened. He felt it then, the old instinct, the one that had run his empire for 20 years, rising up despite everything. Two of his own men were still seated in that gallery, men who would act on a single look from him without hesitation. One glance, one small gesture toward Reeves, and this could end the way things had always ended in his world, quietly, permanently, before the next recess. His jaw tightened. His eyes drifted toward Reeves, still standing, still shouting something at the bailiffs restraining him, still trying to control a room that had already slipped entirely out of his hands. It would be easy. It had always been easy. Dad. The word stopped him cold. Amara hadn't called him that in 10 years, not once. Not in any conversation, not even in her own thoughts, when she let herself remember him. She said it now, quiet enough that only he could hear it over the noise of the room, her eyes locked on his with the same unshakable steadiness she'd had as an 8-year-old refusing to let go of her brother. Not like this, she said. You promised me once you'd let me try it my way. This is my way, let me finish it. Lionel looked at her, really looked, past the gray suit and the composure, and the years that had turned a frightened child into a woman standing in a federal courtroom with more courage than most men he'd ever employed. He thought of Reeves, 20 years at his side, and what that loyalty had actually cost him in the end. He thought of every problem he'd ever solved with silence and consequence, and where that had brought him cuffed, kneeling, seconds from losing everything anyway. For the first time in his adult life, Lionel Jones chose to do nothing. He lowered his eyes from his men in the gallery, gave the smallest shake of his head a signal they understood immediately, one they'd been trained for years to read. Stand down. Then he turned back to his daughter, sat back in his chair, and let her finish what she'd spent a decade building. With the courtroom finally under control, Amara finished what she'd started. She entered the remaining evidence into the record, the shell company filings, the forged signature analysis, the recorded testimony, building a case so thorough that even the prosecutor, watching from his table, stopped objecting somewhere around the 7th exhibit and simply listened. Daniel Reeves was placed under arrest before the judge adjourned for the day, charged with forgery, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and orchestrating the intimidation attempt carried out by his own hired man, Curtis Dale. He said nothing as federal agents let him out, his composure finally completely gone. 3 weeks later, a federal judge dismissed the majority of charges against Lionel Jones, citing the overwhelming evidence that the crimes in question had been orchestrated by Reeves and carried out under his authority alone. Lionel agreed, as part of a broader settlement, to forfeit a significant portion of his remaining assets, a concession his new attorney of record, Amara Whitfield, negotiated and insisted upon herself. She met him the day he walked out of the federal building. No cameras this time, just the two of them on the courthouse steps. You didn't have to give up that much, Lionel said. I didn't do this to get you your money back, she said. I did it to get you out. What happens next is up to you. She placed a folder in his hands, not evidence this time, but a plan. A full restructuring, of what remained: legitimate shipping contracts, dock worker pension reform, and a foundation funded by a portion of the settlement, established in her brother's name, dedicated to housing and feeding homeless children across the city. Lionel looked through it slowly, the same way he'd once looked at a girl beneath a bridge, searching for the catch and finding none. "And if I say no, then I go back to my own life, and you go back to yours," Amara said. "But I don't think that's what you want anymore." Lionel was quiet for a long moment, watching the traffic pass beyond the courthouse steps. Then he signed the first page right there. Without reading the rest, the way a man signs something he's already decided to trust. "All right," he said. "Show me how it's done." The bridge looked different in daylight than it had that winter night 10 years earlier, less abandoned, less desperate, though the cold still cut the same way when the wind came off the water. A small outreach station now stood where the overpass met the street, its modest sign reading "The Lionel Foundation" in simple black letters, funded by what remained of an empire that no longer dealt in fear. Volunteers moved between folding tables, handing out warm meals and blankets to anyone who needed them, no questions asked. Lionel Jones stood near the edge of it, out of place, in a suit far plainer than the ones he used to wear, holding a paper plate of food he just handed to a young boy, no older than 8. Beside him, Amara did the same, working the line with an ease that suggested she'd done this more than once since the foundation opened. When the line thinned, they stood together for a moment, looking out over the water in silence. "You ever think about him?" Lionel asked. "Your brother?" "Every day," Amara said. "This was for him. All of it." Lionel nodded slowly, watching a woman thank one of the volunteers before disappearing back into the cold. "I used to think the smartest thing I ever did was build all this," he said. "The docks, the money, all of it. And now?" He looked at her. Really looked, the way he had in that courtroom when the gunfire never came. "Now I think the smartest thing I ever did was kneel down under a bridge and ask a scared kid what she needed." Amara didn't answer right away. She simply reached over and took his hand, the way she had as a child, learning to trust a stranger's kindness for the first time. Loyalty, she'd learned, was never about blind obedience. It was about staying close enough to someone to save them even from themselves. If this story reminded you that it's never too late to make things right for someone else or for yourself, that's exactly why this channel exists. Subscribe, and let's keep finding the stories worth remembering together.